It's really such a pleasure to be here and to have been invited by the Portland Art Museum to participate in their Artist Talk lecture series. I want to specifically thank Stephanie Parrish and Betsy Knopp, Julia Dolan, and the rest of the Portland Art Museum curatorial team for helping make this a possibility for me. As probably you all might know, the premise of this lecture is the Art Museum asks Northwest artists to select a piece of work that they are particularly inspired by and to discuss it. So when I was invited last fall, I immediately thought of Cindy Sherman's Untitled number 150. It happens to be the sole Cindy Sherman photograph in the museum's collection, and it also happens to be one of my favorites. So I've had a long time love affair with Cindy Sherman in a medium that has had a long history of representing the female form. Sherman's unique and lifelong examination of gender roles, sexuality, female identity, class, and self-portraiture continues to be a primary inspiration for my own artistic endeavors. Last year, about this time, I was in New York City for a few days. I was working on a project, and I had literally a couple of hours. And so I hopped on a train, and I treated myself to the Cindy Sherman retrospective, which was then premiering at the MoMA. I'd been familiar with Sherman's work for several years, but to collectively experience more than 170 photographs culled from 35 years of her practice was far more of a profound experience than I could have prepared for. Sherman's motif of transforming herself into vastly different characters is compelling in and of itself, but to experience the repetition and the evolution of this practice created something bigger than the questions that she asks through these personal transformations. Of course, Cindy Sherman's work is about how female identity is malleable and socially constructed. But as a photographer, I found myself keenly aware of the process and the technique, and was so impressed by her ability to find new and compelling ways to use herself as subject. Sherman created an unpiercing enigma, and not only do I continue to ask myself, who is woman? But while I was at the retrospective, I asked myself, who is Cindy Sherman as an artist? As a young female photo student, I recall how enamored I was when I was first exposed to Sherman's work, the Untitled Film Stills series. At the time, I was a painting and drawing student, as was Cindy Sherman, by the way, before she first took her photo class. And I don't have any particularly romantic story about being given my first camera from my grandfather when I was 8 years old, and I've been photographing ever since. And so my foundation was in painting and drawing, and to see a photographer who was really transforming the way that I had conventionally thought of photography was very inspiring. The Untitled Film Stills series is arguably her most seminal body of work and is certainly her breakthrough series. In case you're not familiar, it's an extensive series of 69 black and white self-portraits created during 1977 to 1980. After she had moved from Buffalo to New York City, where she studied at Buffalo State College. They were primarily taken in and around the city, and she would often use her own apartment and borrow props from her friends to style the space. Apparently, when she first moved to New York City, she was living in a neighborhood that wasn't particularly safe. And she was very surprised at the way that people reacted to her when she was leaving her house, and she became quite fearful about that. And so she recognized the importance of transforming her appearance to not draw attention to herself. Also because of this, she spent a lot of time in her apartment alone. And her photographic process still continues to be this experience of isolation, almost like this trance-like performance where she works by herself with her camera. So the Untitled film still series, she depicted herself in a variety of stereotypical roles from 1950s and 60s Hollywood films, film noir, and European art house films. She's subverting the conventions of historical self-portraiture as she masqueraded into a myriad of characters. And I happen to have the book handy for you. So, so as I said, there's a total of 69 portraits. And so here we see the hopeful starlet. Here we see the dutiful housewife. Here we see the femme fatale. Here we see the self-conscious teenager. The mafia mistress. And I'll gladly pass this around. The Italian maid. And the runaway schoolgirl. And this is probably my favorite Cindy Sherman, quite frankly. So the sheer volume of these transformations really effectively illustrates that gender is malleable. It's a social construct, and there's no such thing as a fixed biological female identity. It's also important to acknowledge the historical context in which that work was made and how it really mobilized a pivotal shift in how we perceive photography. Cindy Sherman perhaps single-handedly elevated photographs from the photo gallery to the art gallery. Untitled film stills countered the classic modernist notion of the photograph as a testament of the photographer's technical prowess, which had been established by modernist pioneers such as Ansel Adams or Edward Weston. Technically, the work is not particularly impressive. For example, many of the photographs are out of focus. Many of them aren't properly exposed. There's light leaks that are present, and also the fact that she photographed on a 35mm camera and intended to print the images relatively small scale in cheap frames was not typical at that time. In fact, the gold standard at that time was for fine art photographers to shoot on a large format camera. So by clearly revealing the artifice of photography, for example, we often see a shutter release cable in the portraits. There's evidence of lights and the fact that the work is clearly staged. Sherman also challenges the myth of the photograph as a truthful document. Cindy Sherman was born in 1954 and was part of the first generation that grew up watching a lot of television. She chose to appropriate the aesthetic and the thematic conventions Like, for example, when you look at that work, we all feel like we know that character. We feel like we know that film, but we can't quite put our finger on it. And so by recontextualizing these existing messages, she forces the viewer to look at them in a more critical way, and in a way that acknowledges the power relations of looking. Through the series, Sherman embraced the then revolutionary notion that all photographs are ideologically motivated. These are the factors that make that work and her subsequent work inherently postmodern. In fact, you would be very hard-pressed to find any writing about postmodern art that doesn't include Cindy Sherman's Untitled film stills. Just ask any of my students. Since Untitled film stills, Sherman has gone on to appropriate other visual motifs. The centerfold, fashion photographs, art historical photographs, soft core sex imagery, and most recently her high-class society portraits. This photograph, Untitled number 150, resides in her Fairy Tales and Disasters series. Perhaps it should be noted that save for Untitled film stills, which she did title, she intentionally didn't title any of her subsequent series, but rather the titles have been assigned to the work by historians and critics in a way to categorize some of the particular periods and themes of her artistic trajectory. In fact, she once stated, and I quote, "I haven't titled anything since the film stills. Besides the fact that I never very much felt like a wordsmith, I didn't want people to have a preconceived notion of what they're supposed to imagine." So that interactive experience that she hopes to elicit with the viewer is part of what makes her work so compelling. During the period of 1985 to 1989, she created the series of photographs which have come to be known as the Fairy Tale and Disaster series. While Sherman had already transitioned from 35 millimeter prints to large-scale color prints, the Fairy Tale Disaster series marks the first time in her career where she starts to employ prosthetic and fake body parts, in addition to elaborate makeup, in an attempt to completely transform herself into these nightmarish and fantastic characters. While the images do not seem to reference any specific fairy tales, much like the feeling, that uncanny feeling that we get with the Untitled film stills, they represent common motifs that are often found in fairy tales. For example, witches, monsters, giants, murders, abductions, and other macabre elements. Sherman explains that these images, and I quote, "have nothing in common with the sweet bedtime stories that we associate with the genre, but rather she's deliberately making images that are fake to make the horror easier to absorb, for she states, 'The real horrors of the world are unmatchable. It's much easier to absorb if it's done in a fake, humorous, and artificial way.'" This photograph retains the cinematic conventions of off-camera presence, which she frequently employed in the Untitled film stills series. So immediately we start to craft some sort of a narrative about who this nightmarish creature is. We start to think about what kind of environment she's in and what is commanding her gaze beyond the scope of the frame. The next question we ask ourselves is, what's with the tongue? It's clearly fake. It's less of a representational tongue. It's less of a representational real tongue as it is more of a mythological representation of a tongue. It's far too big, it's too dark, it's too red, it's too wet, it's too stiff. And these are the characters that contribute to its emphasis. The tongue in general has sexual implications, But I think we can agree that this image does not elicit any particular sexual impulses in the most conventional sense. So, for example, if I was to describe this image objectively to perhaps an audience who can't see it, and in fact, why don't you indulge me for a second and close your eyes? It might go something like this. So there's a young female nude who's shot from an elevated angle which peers down at her. Her body is in a vulnerable gesture as she delicately touches her tongue with her fingers. Her face and body glistening with sweat as she gazes upward to someone or something the viewer is not privy to. You can open your eyes now. So one might envision a sexual image of desire or lust. The way that Sherman has simultaneously appropriated the motifs of erotica with nightmarish fairy tales creates this cognitive dissonance that is what makes the work at the same time both alluring and disturbing. Furthermore, the setting in which she appears larger than life, almost like a monstrous giant on a planet of tiny people, which, like the tongue, are artificial. In fact, they're actual miniature figurines that you can find in most hobby shops or toy stores. Creates a scenario that is so bizarre, the viewer has no other choice but to wonder what this existence is about. And so they try to craft a narrative around it. So while they are trying to make sense of this implied story, the relative large scale of the photograph effectively invites or perhaps even forces the viewer to inhabit this surreal, nightmarish world with her, whether they want to or not. Other formal and technical devices that contribute to the unsettling essence of this image is the dramatic use of light on the primary character. She's essentially shrouded in darkness. There are highlights that are illuminating the sweat on her body and face, as well as the saliva on her tongue. There are a myriad of contrasts between Sherman's character and the tiny, bustling, but seemingly uncivilized society in the sand, which she is literally turning her back to. As noted, Sherman is dramatically underlit in comparison to this intensely illuminated other world. Its kind of cyan light source connotes perhaps a different planet. For example, Neptune is associated with a bluish green hue. And that's what's creating this backlight, which also effectively isolates her. It simultaneously reflects a sickly green hue on her otherwise natural skin tone. There is a monumental contrast in scale between Sherman's character and the civilians, and perhaps there's even a scale hierarchy at play here. While she appears almost oblivious to this world behind her, and the fact that she has her back turned to them suggests that she feels safe and that she does not perceive them as a threat. But yet she still has a gesture of submission or fear to that person or entity that she's gazing upward at. So perhaps that person or entity is even larger than she is. Additionally, the tiny civilians are dressed in a variety of primary colors, while Sherman's character is nude. Nudity is often synonymous with vulnerability, and while she's crouching down and she's turning her shoulders inward and she's displaying a gesture of someone who may be protecting themselves, we don't really get the sense that it's because she's unclothed. Even though this is one of the distinctions that separates her from the rest of the figures in the narrative, almost like an animal, we get the sense that perhaps she doesn't wear clothes. But this vulnerable reaction is caused by some sort of impending threat. But what is that impending threat? These unanswered questions, again, are part of the enigma that defines Cindy Sherman's work. As I mentioned, when I first started studying photography in college, I was immediately inspired by Sherman's work. Recently, I revisited some of the photographs that I made in my Photo 1 class. And the impression that Cindy Sherman's work had on me, I think, is clearly evident. So I'm going to pass these around. Now, this does feel a little bit like airing out my dirty laundry, but, but I still think that it's an important part of my path as a young aspiring artist. So like Cindy Sherman, I was thinking, clearly combining some of the motifs of fairy tales, thinking about a narrative, and constructing a particular scene. Also photographing, depicting a time that isn't now. Paying attention to dramatic lighting and patterns and textures. Somewhere along the line, I acquired a Cindy Sherman wig, I guess. And it's really interesting because none of this work was made under, there's a really popular assignment where you try the hat on of your favorite photographer and you make work that's an emulation of it. And nope, this is just the stuff I was making. And so in some ways, looking at it, I just, it's kind of endearing, but it's kind of embarrassing how highly influenced I was by her work. This is a contact sheet that I must have cut out some of my selects, but at any rate, maybe I'll kind of split this up a little bit. In fact, could I trouble you to do that? Okay, thanks. Okay, so like Sherman, I too have consistently examined female identity in my own work, though most of my work has been inspired by personal life experiences. Again, the way that I craft a narrative, the artifice of the camera, the way that I try to engage the viewer in a story certainly harkens back to my early Cindy Sherman-inspired work. As with Sherman's work, my own aesthetic and process has been influenced by existing visual sources, such as fairy tales, art history, paintings, and cinema. In fact, we both have noted that classic horror films and the work of Alfred Hitchcock are inspiration. I do have a book from one of my more recent bodies of work. This is perhaps my breakthrough series, Sparrow Lane. And so you can see I'm using some of the cinematic tropes of engaging the viewer and thinking about who or what the subject is looking at. I'm being very conscientious about deliberately composing the scene, thinking about the dramatic use of light and various other pattern and texture and color combinations. And likewise, I'll pass this around. As with Cindy Sherman, I also oftentimes use the conventional protagonist and antagonist conflict And similar to the work of Cindy Sherman, typically the antagonist resides beyond the scope of the frame. So I've created 2 pieces to pay homage to Cindy Sherman's artistic contributions. One of them was created in celebration for International Women's Day at PNCA, where I sometimes teach. And they were creating an updated version of Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. Is anyone familiar with The Dinner Party? Okay. So it was a very seminal body of work in the 1970s, right at the height of second wave feminism. And basically it's this really monumental installation of a dinner party, and it's a triangular table. Of course, that was referencing the pelvic region. And each side of the table sat 30, was a place setting for 39 women. And so each one of the place settings had a very intricate ceramic sculpture to honor that specific woman. And over 400 people contributed to the creation of the dinner party, and its goal, in Judy Chicago's own words, was to end the ongoing cycle of omission in which women were written out of the historical record. Some of perhaps the most well-known females who were in the dinner party are Georgia O'Keeffe, Virginia Woolf, and let's see here, Emma Dickinson.
Well, the early goddesses too.
Yes, there were some mythological women as well. Okay, so PNCA had this really great idea that they were going to create an updated version of the dinner party, and they asked female artists in Portland to make a plate in honor of an artist who has made a significant contribution. Well, I'm not sure if they asked about a particular artist. I think they may have. Anyway, immediately, obviously, I thought of Cindy Sherman. So I made this. Okay, it's dinner time. And I suppose I can pass this around as well. But rather than approaching it photographically, I chose to approach it as a sculpture. And so I looked back on the historical evolution of her work, and I decided to cull some of the rather iconic elements that might represent the specific periods of that she's become identified for. So I have the clown nose and the buck teeth, which represent her period of the carnival and the macabre. Of course, the blonde wig, which is a reoccurring prop, I guess, in many of the Untitled film stills. The fairy tale and disaster series employs, there's lots of images of like dirt and mud and vomit and fake feces. And then the high class society portraits, I've included a mirror and some, sorry, that light's catching me right in the eye. So I'm going to keep doing it. And a necklace and some lipstick. And then there's one of my favorite pieces from her Centerfold series is an image of a woman who is waiting by a phone, waiting for the phone to ring. There's also a doll arm, which represents her sex series where she took a break from employing herself as subject and rather assembled dolls and medical body parts that were kind of caught in the act of perverted actions. Okay, so you can pass that around. Let's see, anything else? So additionally, as I was revisiting Cindy Sherman's Untitled 150, I decided to emulate it photographically. So for a day, last Saturday, I tried to sink into the skin of Cindy Sherman and imagine the process that she may have gone through in preparing for this photograph. So I went to a hardware store and I bought 12 pounds of sand. I went to a hobby shop and I bought some tiny figurines. The tongue I carved out of red pepper, and the wig I found in my own private collection. And so with the help of JD and Maddie and Abby, we transformed JD's studio into this space and attempted to recreate this image. Now I have to say it was a little harder than I thought, and it's certainly not a flawless recreation. So one of the things that was immediately clear right away was that the scene in the background couldn't be shot at the same time with myself as the character. And although I was able to piece it together in post-production through Photoshop, Photoshop wasn't accessible in 1985, though at the time it was well known that Cindy Sherman was using back projections. So she probably used a back projection to create this impossible perspective shift that's happening here. And one of the things I noted is I wasn't actually able to use this piece, and so I simply Googled the image online, and so when I was lighting it and color correcting it, I was using a version that clearly is more blue than the original. So this is a really great lesson that the reproductions online oftentimes don't represent the original.
This one actually changed, and the colors have changed from the time this was taken.
Yeah, that's probably possible. I can't say for sure. I would suspect that the utmost care has been given so that it hasn't faded, but I don't know what it looked like at the time that it was created. When I did go and see the retrospective, I did notice that some of the images seemed faded, some of the prints seemed not in the most pristine condition.
This was not a stable medium when it was taken. Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, so besides my collaboration with Cindy Sherman, that concludes my presentation. I would be thrilled to try to entertain any questions that you may have. Yeah.
I'm not very familiar with photography, but how did you discover, or why do you say that the back part was taken or pieced together?
Oh, well, because basically we set up this village in JD's studio, and we lit it, and then it just wasn't possible. It just was not. No, the perspective of it. This is shot from a higher angle looking down, and it wasn't possible to get the same gesture. And so, so at that point, we decided to shoot this first, and then shoot the background second.
You've been to see the dinner party yourself in Brooklyn?
I haven't. I would like to see it, though.
You should.
I know, it's important work for sure.
Can you explain a little bit of the lighting setup that you had? I know I see some filters.
Yeah, you know, actually we used, I feel like if I could do this again, I would do it differently. But we use hot lights for the creature or the character or myself. And then rather than using gels, I was able to systematically alter the color in post-production. We had noted that it appeared as though, and now it doesn't seem like it's a case because of course I was working from something that was online, but I thought that there was some sort of a blue chalk or a residue on her shoulder, and so so we drew that, you know, we actually literally had chalk and I drew it on my shoulder, and now it appears that it's light that's refracting in a certain way. Yeah, yeah.
Has she ever commented on this photo? Like, is there any insight as to what it means or like what it's about?
Well, she's actually pretty, she's actually kind of dismissive about her individual photographs in general. And she typically doesn't go into them with a lot of intention. And so I wasn't able to find anything specifically about what that, you know, why she, like, what is the story? And in the research that I conducted, I was able to find a lot of confusion and ideas, but yeah, she wasn't intending to create a particular story. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was curious how it felt to play that character, you know, because you had to embody that character in reproducing this, and if it gave you any further insights into what, you know, kind of like what you feel
Yeah.
she's about.
Yeah, absolutely. Cindy Sherman is incredibly talented in front of the camera. That's what I learned. And I'm actually pretty uncomfortable in front of the camera, and also pretty uncomfortable not being behind the camera. So it was really hard for me to, you know, I could perform in my own way, but to try to really recreate the essence of what she was trying to communicate, and something else is communicated in my photograph. And I'm not quite sure what that is, but yeah, so I mean, fortunately, I don't really identify with this person. Like, it really feels like fortunately, it really feels like a masquerade. I don't feel like this is a self-portrait of me in the same way that Sherman doesn't feel like any of her work are self-portraits of her. Yeah.
To me, in the Sparrow Lane book, the major actor is the lighting, and it's that very sort of golden light that sort of is the major player in all of the pictures, and I wondered if you could comment on how you imagine the lighting.
Yeah. Yeah, and in some instances, like in the glowing drawer, for example, the light is actually the it's the forbidden knowledge, it's the forbidden like clue that they're finding. Perhaps I should preface a little bit, or maybe reveal what this work is about. Very much inspired by Nancy Drew book covers. And I had grown up reading Nancy Drew as a child. I wanted to use those technical and visual conventions to create an elliptical narrative about a group of young girls who are on the search of discovering forbidden knowledge, and that forbidden knowledge is a metaphor for that precarious transition from girl to woman, where a young female starts to feel simultaneously empowered, but there's also an impending threat by her newfound sexuality. So there are iconic and almost cliche symbolic objects such as skeleton keys and keyholes and flashlights and open purses and open windows and stairwells, and that suggests psychosexual metaphors. Yes.
All of Cindy Sherman's work that I've seen only has her in it, and I don't know if there's anything that has other people in it. Do you have any insight?
Well,
She only uses her son.
in the late 80s, during some of the like censorship hysteria that became very, there were some rather sensational artists who had received NEA grants, and they were being rescinded. And maybe you remember Robert Mapplethorpe and Karen Finley, yeah, of course, and Andre Serrano. And so she wanted to make a body of work about sex. And of course, this is during, the AIDS, when AIDS was really in the air. And so she wanted to make a body of work that was rather offensive and sexually explicit, and she took herself out of those photographs and rather, for a brief period of time, used dolls and constructed these sculptural objects that, and you can Google them, they're pretty fascinating. Because they're dolls, of course, they make them like approachable, but there's definitely a very disturbing and perverted subject.
Grotesque work.
It is some of her most grotesque work, I agree. Yeah, no, that's her bag. Yeah.
This is probably a pretty obvious question, but she's famous as a photographer, and she's also famous for being in her photographs. So the obvious question, who's taking the picture and what kind of collaborative process is involved?
That is a good question. Well, as you can see in a lot of the Untitled film stills, you can see the shutter release cable. Robert Longo, who was her boyfriend at the time of the Untitled film stills, who's also an artist, he's a painter, and had a really celebrated career in the 80s as well, collaborated with her and helped her, I guess, fire the shutter for some of her images. From what I understand, she works in isolation. As I mentioned before, she kind of sinks into this like performative, trance-like space. And I think that isolation is a part of her ability to conjure up these various facial gestures and expressions. So she probably uses something very sophisticated by now, I would imagine. A remote timer or something where all she has to do is like think about it and her shutter. But yeah, of course, I'm sure that there have been other people in her process who have helped her photograph her vision, who have been the person that fired the button.
Does she talk about her process at all on the point of like how many takes she does before she feels like she gets the shot, or how much time she spends on each one? Is it like a day, or is it weeks, or?
Again, I'm not really sure if I can answer that. There's a really great Art 21, and it shows her process of she goes shopping and she's picking out all these objects, and then she's I think she worked very intuitively, and she has kind of this enormous collection of makeup and prosthetics, and but as far as I would suspect that a lot of the like what the final manifestation comes from her process of editing through her takes, based on my own experience as a photographer, but I can't answer that question, but I would be happy to research it and get back to you.
Based on what you did, it took you a lot of effort and other people to reproduce.
Yeah, what was most hard about this? What was most hard? The hardest thing about this was that I was trying to like contort my body into a body that isn't mine. I'm not sure what what lens that she was using, and so that was the hardest part about this particular project, and I wanted to emulate it as close to my abilities could allow me to do that, and but I recognize that there are some differences for sure.
Maybe you can get an idea of how much effort she put into that if she did it all herself. And you did the ones.
Yes, exactly. I know. And she was shooting on film versus digital, so it's real hard to imagine. Yeah.
Is the idea that it's actually a tongue corroborated by her, or is that something you're making up? Is it
Oh.
food, or is it a tongue, or is it, did she say?
Well, I couldn't find any evidence of Cindy Sherman specifically talking about this piece or the tongue in general, but there's plenty of writing that suggests that it's a tongue. Do you see it as something else?
I kind of see maybe ostracization from society, where she's naked and she's often hails from the society. She maybe
Yeah.
sits there hunkering down eating.
Oh, yeah.
That's really the first time I've seen it. So.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about your work or your process in taking the photos, just because you are working now in a digital age where you have the opportunity to use these mediums?
Uh-huh.
So I'm curious as to how you're using the new mediums to get new dramatic light perspectives, because from your body of work already, like your ability to work with synesthesia is incredible.
Uh-huh.
It's very
What is
useful.
synesthesia?
Synesthesia is your ability to see and simultaneously perceive light, color, and sound as an
Oh.
illustration.
Wow, I have that.
Maybe all artists do, but your ability to recapture this moment is brilliant. I love the chalk. The chalk is just so clever, and it's interesting too, just the way that you mix that physical space with that digital space, or however you layer that.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure.
Okay, so let's just break that down again. Can you be a little bit more specific about what you want to know about, like, my process, or?
I just want to know, like, you obviously love color, or
Yeah.
you're used with color. There's something very still about the images. You capture that moment that is the aha moment. It's almost as if things have been wiped away. And you talk about objectification. You talk about that woman that is inside and that is there and that is
Yeah.
trapped. I'm just wondering what your thoughts about physical what you notice.
Okay. All right. I'm going to take a stab at it. So usually when I'm working, I have like a pretty preconceived idea in my mind of what I want to create, and then I seek out to attempt to reproduce that vision photographically. Of course, I can never aestheticize what's in my mind, and so there's always this like grieving period where I have to let go of my what I've imagined and accept what I've shot. And sometimes what I've shot is perhaps even more compelling than what was in my mind, but and I can come to terms with that a little bit later. So that's why I don't really consider myself like a formalist photographer. And in fact, it feels weird even calling myself a photographer. Like I know I'm a photographer, but who knows? I mean, maybe.
You started in drawing and painting, right?
Yeah, and maybe in a year I'll start painting again. But right now it feels like photography is the most effective way to communicate the ideas that I want to elicit.
I'm a painter as well, and I feel the same way. There's something about photography that you can capture the moment,
Yeah.
so specifically orchestrated because you can perceive it as you perceive in everyday life.
Sure.
Whereas a painting, you didn't have that digital altering that you could somehow grasp something. So now we have the ability to look back on these people like Cindy Sherman and emulate and then reorchestrate
Yeah, yeah.
and add another layer on top of. It's an evolution. Like I see your work as an evolution of Cindy Sherman's work.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I can't imagine like what kind of work I would be making if I hadn't been familiar with her work, both in the way that she was using photography conceptually, but then also the themes that she was examining as well. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you were saying that you do a lot of post-editing and that's where you spend a lot of your time. And when you're using Photoshop, I always find when I'm playing with my photo, like how, I don't know, but how do you know when you're done? Like, how do you stop yourself and be like, that's what I want to present?
That's a problem for sure. There's this saying that a film is never finished and it's only abandoned, and I think the same can be true of a photograph. And so I see that the way that I work are in 3 stages. There's the concept development stage where I think about like what it is that I want to create, why I want to create it. And I know that's kind of an academic approach to making art, but that's really my background. So I think about what I'm going to create, and then there's the process of creating it, the shoot day. And then there's the final stage, which is the post stage. And that's where I really get to experiment with, I do compositing, and I think about like how I can intensify light, or maybe I want to intensify color, or maybe I want to remove this, or maybe I want to move this, or whatever. And so I can get into a zone that is can be pretty intense, where everything else just is. Sometimes I'll be like, wow, I haven't left my house for 5 days. I have had to go pee for 4 hours. But I just gotta change this 1 pixel or something. But so I very much think of, that's where like my painting and drawing comes out, no doubt about it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, you spend a long time, and it's just,
Okay.
it's just hard, I guess.
Oh yeah, so I mean sometimes if there's like, I don't know, and of course my my eye is getting more decisive. Like I'm having like my first big retrospective of work at the Haley Ford Museum in Salem, and it opens on May 31st. And I had to reprint like all of this work that has already printed and exhibited. And when I opened up the files, I noticed things I had to change. I mean, nothing like real dramatic because, some of those work has sold, so it feels like that would be disingenuous. But like certain things where I felt like, oh wow, I've got to kind of dial down that or this. Yes.
So if I remember correctly, Cindy Sherman dabbled in filmmaking, and she made that horror film.
She did. It's called Office Killer.
That's what Office Killer.
Yeah.
Visions to make film?
Well, I have made film in the past. In fact, my film collaborator, Grace Carter, is here. And I think there's an obvious dialogue between film and my photographic work. What I noticed about film is it's very laborious and it's very expensive and it's very takes a really long time to complete even a short film. Our most courageous endeavor was a 17-minute narrative film. And frankly, by the time that we finished it, I was kind of, at that time, kind of like a little bit over it. And I think that's like pretty classic. And I think there was a period of time where there was kind of like a fork in the road, and I made some photographic work, and it received maybe more recognition or demand than my film work, and so I felt like I followed that path, and I feel like it has been the right one for me.
I find that a part of your work that attracted me to you and that I find very joyful about your process is that you love props and shopping for props and finding things, and also that everything looks very vintage. Can you just talk about that aspect?
Yeah, for sure. I have, my whole life, I have felt as though I've lived in a time that isn't now. In fact, when I was in the 4th grade, I had like real bad buck teeth, and I invented this imaginary high school, and everyone at this high school had buck teeth, but I changed the name of the buck teeth to Vanji teeth, and it was Vanji High. But the reason why I bring this up is because I still have it. The yearbook was from 1973. And so I'm not really sure why a 9-year-old in the 80s would like place themselves in this fictitious high school from the 70s. So I've just always been kind of I've always been a bit of, I've had an affinity for the past, and my favorite time period is probably like the 50s through the early 80s. And I don't try to epitomize a certain time period when I'm working, but rather I'm trying to suggest that they're in a time that's not now. And I think most of us have a special feeling for nostalgia, and so I think that that's like a visual and conceptual device that I use.